What the heck is that? Is something the matter? No, it's nothing. My apologies. I got a little carried away. For a moment, Ainz reverted to his true self, but he immediately resumed his act. If he had a human body, he would have been drenched in a cold sweat. The village chief seemed taken aback, but his expression quickly returned to normal. Perhaps in the chief's mind, magic casters were already categorized as eccentrics, or at least somewhat odd. In that case, this might be a stroke of luck, Ainz thought. Shall I prepare a drink for you? No, I'm fine. Ainz raised a hand to decline the chief's offer. The warm water his wife had prepared earlier was no longer steaming. He hadn't taken a single sip. It would be too rude to ask for more. The chief's wife was no longer in the room. She had been asked to go outside to help with various cleanup tasks. Now, only Ainz and the village chief remained. After storing the staff of Ainz Uwalgaun in his item box, the first thing Ainz asked about was the surrounding nations. And the answer he received was the names of countries he had never heard of. Initially, Ainz had felt a sense of unease, but he had still been thinking with the world of Yggdrasil as his baseline. Since he could use Yggdrasil magic, that was a natural line of thought. But now he was greeted by place names that were completely foreign to him. What's this Baharoth Empire? What's this Re-Estais Kingdom? I've never heard of such things in Norse mythology. His vision swam, and he steadied his collapsing body by pressing a gauntleted hand against the table. He had simply arrived in a world he knew nothing about. He could comprehend it, but accepting it was difficult. And the shock was greater than he had expected. Ainz told himself to calm down, and once again recalled the information he had just learned about the surrounding nations and their geography. First, the Baharoth Empire and the Re-Estais Kingdom. Their borders were separated by a mountain range that ran between them. To the south, where the mountains ended, lay a great forest. This village and a fortress city were located near the edge of that forest. He was told that wars were typically fought over control of this fortress city. In fact, the empire had apparently engaged in several skirmishes there over the past few years. Indeed, it was said the empire was currently building up a position near the fortress city, leading to talk that another war might break out soon. And south of that fortress city was another nation, the Slain Theocracy. To briefly explain the territorial relationships, you could visualize it roughly by drawing a circle and placing an inverted T inside it. The Re-Estais Kingdom is on the left, the Baharoth Empire on the right, and the Slain Theocracy on the bottom. There were apparently other countries, but this was the extent of the village chief's knowledge. And as the chief of a small village, he knew nothing of their respective national strengths. In other words, that meant a blunder. This meant there was a very real possibility that the knights from before were from the Slain Theocracy, though it was also conceivable they were part of an imperial strategy to invade the kingdom's interior through the Great Forest. Releasing all the knights was a mistake. He should have captured a few and extracted all the information they had. Now that he was calm, he realized his failure to consider that was the height of folly. In that case, on top of considering the Slain Theocracy, he would also need to prepare some measures against the empire. Ainz wondered, was he the only one who had come to this world? 1 or 2 players wouldn't be a problem. Considering the full might of the Great Tomb of Nazarick, they could annihilate about 30 level 100 players at once. Ainz himself, combining the effects of cash shop items and the like, could likely fight on par with or better than 2 players. Thinking of combat first might be a rather dangerous mindset. However, Ainz was not so childish as to act without considering the worst-case scenario. He was simply planning his response to potential problems from the outset. If he were to get along with others, there would be no need for special countermeasures. He could just improvise as situations arose. The problem would be if the guild that held the Sky Fortress of Asgard, the guild that controlled the glacial castle in the depths of Helheim, or the guild that ruled the field known as the birthing grounds of the fire giants in Muspelheim were here. These 3 guilds were on par with Ainz Uwalgaun. If these guilds had come, it would be fine if things proceeded amicably with their members. But what if they didn't? He didn't know how many members those guilds had retained until the end. Still, there would likely be at least a few players with abilities comparable to his. That meant he had to act in a way that avoided conflict with them. At the same time, he needed to expand his own forces and gather information. If a large number of players had come, they would either band together or act individually. Given the Japanese national temperament, he suspected they would be more likely to form a group. If so, he would want to join them if possible. He was willing to make any number of concessions on matters unrelated to Ain's OverLord. The issue would be if that group considered him an enemy. He thought it unlikely, but he couldn't rule it out. First, they might be driven by justice or righteous indignation. To avoid this, he should refrain from hostile actions, for example, causing harm in the surrounding area. Anyone would be disgusted by brainless things like mass slaughter. Of course, it might be different if he had a reason that could convince them, like how he saved this village from an attack. In short, it would undoubtedly be useful to have some kind of just cause for his future actions. In other words, the "I didn't want to do this, but I had no choice" approach. Second, they might have a grudge against Ain's OverLord. In that case, battle would be unavoidable. He needed to formulate countermeasures for that. This was a task for the future. And the most foolish plan of all would be to hole up in the Great Tomb of Nazarick. Even Ainz could easily imagine how foolish a siege defense would be without any chance of reinforcements. So, I wasn't wrong after all. Has something been the matter for a while now? No, it's nothing. I was just a bit flustered because things are different from what I expected. My apologies. More importantly, could you tell me about the currency next? Yes, of course. The village chief placed a few copper coins on the table. For the common trade coins, the symbol of the god of commerce is a wheel, so one side has a wheel. The other side is engraved with the symbol of the Merchants Guild. Since he didn't have any gold coins, the chief showed him the copper ones. Ainz flipped one over and confirmed the engraving. He mentioned a trade gold coin earlier, or just gold coin for short. He said it was the most trusted and widely circulated currency because its value was guaranteed by the Merchants Guild. It weighed 10 grams. Value was determined more by weight than size, but it was about 30 millimeters in diameter. The currency consisted of copper, silver, gold, and platinum coins, as well as a brass plate worth 1/4 of a copper coin. Platinum coins were apparently rarely used. The chief and his wife said they had never seen one in their lives, so it was safe to assume they were used by merchants and nobles. The conversion rates for each coin were 1,000 copper coins equal 100 silver coins, equal 10 gold coins, equal 1 platinum coin. The monetary value of the coins was roughly 1,000 Japanese yen for 1 copper coin and 100,000 yen for 1 gold coin. Typically, the daily wage for an artisan was just under 1 silver coin. A farmer earned even less, about 6 copper coins. In a way, the cost of goods was high. A ceramic cup, for example, cost 2 copper coins. On the other hand, food was cheap. It seemed primary industries were cheap, while secondary industries were expensive. Ainz was relieved. For the time being, it seemed he wouldn't have to worry about money. He had nearly 1,000 million in Yggdrasil currency. It looked like he wouldn't have to touch the gold his friends had left behind in the treasury. The unit 1G might sound like a huge sum, but in Yggdrasil, the price of a top-tier weapon sold in a personal shop could easily exceed 100 M, 100,000. If it had over-enchantment data on it, even 1G might not be enough. Ainz himself possessed several pieces of equipment that were worth more than 1G. He was told that monsters also existed. There were creatures called magical beasts deep in the Great Forest, as well as demi-human races like elves and goblins. Apparently, some demi-humans had even formed their own nations. The people who hunted these monsters for rewards were called adventurers. It seemed there were quite a few magic casters among them. Of course, the village chief had never seen one himself, so this was just hearsay from merchants who visited the village. However, it seemed true that there was an adventurers' guild in the larger cities. With that, Ainz asked about the nearest fortress city. The chief wasn't sure of its population, but he said it was fairly large. It was a focal point of war between the 3 nations, and, he had heard, had never once fallen in a very long time. If he wanted to gather information, that would be the best place. Ainz decided as much. And finally, a rather laughable discovery. In the world of Yggdrasil,
It wouldn't be strange for Japanese to be understood because Yggdrasil was a Japanese-made game. Yet he had been wondering why Japanese worked in this completely different world. So, Ainz had been watching the village chief's mouth movements, and to his amusement, he realized they weren't speaking Japanese at all.
The movements of their mouths and the sounds he heard were completely different. He had the chief help him with a few experiments. The chief was wary at first, but he cooperated once Ainz explained it was a harmless experiment related to magic. The conclusion. It was as if everyone in this world had eaten a translation cognac. He didn't know who was feeding it to them, though. It seemed that language, or rather words, in this world were automatically translated to their essential meaning before reaching the listener. For example, there is an internet slang term, WKT. If you said that to an elderly person on the street who doesn't use the internet, would they understand? They wouldn't. But in this world, they would. That was because the essence of the word was being conveyed. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that the meaning of the words was being transmitted. It was like speaking with your mouth while simultaneously conveying the content via telepathy. If one recognized words as words, it might even be possible to communicate with non-human creatures, like dogs or cats, for instance. The problem was that he had no idea why this was happening. And the village chief didn't find it strange at all. It was perfectly normal to him. In other words, it must be a law of this world. Thinking about it calmly, this was a world with magic, a world that completely ignored the law of entropy. It wouldn't be strange for a completely different set of laws to govern it. The problem was that Ainz was the only one who didn't know these laws. Let's use an analogy. On a hot summer day, you walk into a McDonald's and see an odd man buy a Coke in front of you. Then the man walks outside. Would you warn him, "Sir, your ice will melt"? Of course not. That's obvious. It's common sense. Now suppose there was a law in this world where a magic caster who goes outside on a specific day has their ability sealed for a month. If Ainz were to walk outside, would anyone warn him? Of course not. Why? Because to them, it's common sense. The logic may be a bit forced, but he was sure the point was clear. And common sense is something so vital that lacking it could lead to a fatal blunder. Ainz was currently in a state of lacking it. He needed to do something, but no good ideas came to mind. Was he supposed to bring someone here and demand they tell him everything they considered common sense? That was an absurd notion, which meant there was really only one course of action. I suppose I'll have to go live in a city. To learn common sense, one needs many examples to follow. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. People of the old days understood this well. Besides, he also needed to learn about this world's magic. There was still so much he had to learn. As Ainz was thinking this, he heard the faint sound of footsteps on the dirt from beyond the thin wooden door. The interval between steps was long, but it didn't sound like kicking. It sounded like an unhurried man. Just as Ainz turned his head toward the door, a knock echoed through the room. The village chief looked at Ainz, seeking his reply. Ainz had no reason to object. "I don't mind. My apologies." The village chief gave a slight bow, stood up, and walked to the door. When he opened it, a villager stood there, backlit by the light from outside. The villager's gaze shifted from the chief to Ainz. "Chief, sorry to interrupt while you have a guest, but the funeral preparations are ready." "Oh." The chief looked at Ainz as if asking for permission. Of course, Ainz had no right to stop it. "Please, don't mind me." "Thank you." "Then tell everyone I'll be there shortly." "Understood." After the villager closed the door and left, the chief bowed to Ainz. "My sincerest apologies. A funeral has come up, so I must ask for a little of your time." "I understand." "And there is one thing I'd like to ask. This is something I'd like you to discuss with the other villagers."